we are from Group 7 and we will present our PPT about imperialism and colonialism. Our group consists of 9 members as written below.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Ramatan Duli Wijayanto, and today I would like to explain about imperialism. Imperialism is the process of extending one state control over another process that make many forms. In colonial times, this meant the colonizing nation annexed territory outright. The people they were colonizing to their new state. And informal imperialism was a form of state power exercised by stronger state over weaker state that allow weaker state to maintain their independence while reducing their sovereignty. Informal imperialism took the form of carving out zones of European sovereignty and privilege such as treaty ports within other states. Both formal and informal imperialism expanded dramatically in the 19th century. Between 1870 and 1900, a group of states colonized about 1/4 of the world land surface. The scramble for Africa was the most startling case of formal imperialism from 1875 to 1902. Many Europeans convinced in the 19th century that their developed science and technology would inevitably bring progress to the rest of the world. European empire was against the backdrop of industrialization, liberal revolution, and the rise of nation states. Industrialization produced generate demand for raw material from distant location. In Britain and France, 19th century imperial powers were in principle democratic nations, where government authority relied on consent and on nation of civic equality. And the resistance of colonized people did as shape the history of colonialism as did the ambitious plans. The Haitian of 1804 complete the British and French to end slavery in their colonies. And the American Revolution encouraged the British to self-government to white settled state in Canada 1867 and Australia 1901 and New Zealand 1912. In general, 19th century imperialism involved less independent entrepreneurial activity by merchant and trade, one more settlement and discipline. And next will be explained by Nikita Rizia.
So the next one is about the Colonialism and its causes. In early 1902, G.A. Hobson, a British author, thought that wealthy financiers had influenced the scramble of Africa. He believed that international economic has distorted England's interest. And as a result, Hobson's analysis inspired an influential imperialism critique made by Vladimir Lenin. Lenin believed that imperialism was best understood in economic grounds, but however, he believed that imperialism was an integral part of late 19th century capitalism. With domestic markets saturated and growth limited by competition at home, capitalists were forced to invest and search for new markets overseas, producing an even more intensive pressure for the expansion of European imperialism. Next, please. The historian now agree that economic pressures were only one of the causes of imperialism, and imperialism emphasized strategic and nationalist motive because there are international rivalries which made European powers determined to control less developed nations and territories. Then French politicians hoped that imperialism would restore the honor France that lost in their defeat by Persian in 1870. The interpretation suggests a link between imperialism and 19th century state and nation building. Colonies demonstrate military power, nation's economy, the strength of its citizens, the force of its law, and also the power of its culture. And finally, the imperialism had important culture dimension. Scottish missionary David Livingstone believed that British conquest of Africa would end the East African slave trade and introduce the Negro family into the body of corporate nations. Taking arms against the slave, famine, disorder, and illiteracy seemed to many Europeans not only a reason to invade Africa, but also a duty and proof of a somehow superior civilization. Their convictions did not cause imperialism, but they illustrate how Central Empire building became the West-South image. Next, please.
Okay, next is imperialism in South Asia. India was the center as well as the jewel of the British crown, secured even before the time of imperialism of the subcontinent began in the 1790s and quickened during the Age of Revolution. Conquering India helped compensate for losing North America. British East India Company is the controller of British territories in India until mid-19th century. The company divided into European and India divisions. The company managed to head its own military and responsible in collecting taxes from Indian peasants. The mid-19th century is a crucial phase because by this time, India was the focal point of Britain's expanded global power. Next, please. And then the British policy were shifted between two poles. One group wanted to westernize India and the other group that believed it is more practical and safer to obey the local culture. Some conflict, including the replacement of blind superstition to genial influence of Christian light and truth, also the attempt of intervention in India's institutions, are the examples that the British never agreed on cultural policy. Next.
In 1857 until 1858, it was badly shaken by a revolt of India soldiers in the British Army, now known in India as the Great Mutiny of 1857. The uprising began near Delhi when the military disciplined a regiment of sepoys, the traditional term of for refusing to use rifle cartridges greased with pork fat, unacceptable to either Hindus or Muslims. The causes of the mutiny were deeper and involved social, economic, and political grievances. Indian peasants attacked law courts and burned tax roll, protesting debt and corruption. The mutiny spread through large areas of northwest India. Loyal Indian troops were brought south from the frontiers, and British troops, fresh from the Crimean War, were from Britain to suppress the rebellion. Whole rebel units were killed rather than being allowed to surrender or tried on the spot and executed. After the mutiny, the British were compelled to recognize their Indian empire, developing new strategies of rule. The East India Company was abolished, replaced by the British Crown. The principles of indirect rule: we shall respect the right, dignity, and honor of native prince as our own subjects, should enjoy that prosperity and that social advancement which can only be secured by internal peace and good government. Next slide, please.
Okay, we move to the next part, the legacy of colonialism. Civil service reform opened new position to members of the Indian upper classes. The British had to reconsider their relationship to Indian cultures. Missionary activity was no longer encouraged, and the British channeled their reforming impulse into the more secular project of economic development, railway, roads, irrigation, and so on. The British tried both policies in fits and starts until the end of British rule in 1947. In India, the most prominent representative of the new imperialism was Lord Curzon, the Viceroy of India from 1898 to 1905. Curzon deepened British commitment to the region. Concerned about the British position in the world, he warned of the need to fortify India's border against Russia. He urged continued economic investment. Curzon worried that the British would be worn down by resistance to the rights and that comforted with their apparent inability to transform Indian culture. They would become cynical, get lethargic, and think only of home. Next, please. Okay, so what did India do for Great Britain? By the eve of the World was Britain export market. One tenth of all the British Empire trade passed through India's port city of Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. Indian laborers worked on the tea plantation in Assam near Burma, and they built railways and dams in southern Africa and Egypt. Over a million Indian servants left their country in the second half of the century to work elsewhere in the empire. The European settlers in the region, a conflict that led to the Boer War in 1899. This battle over strategic advantage, diamond, and European pride was typical of the scramble. African people to face the coming of Europe country indirectly. Local elites friendly to European interest to lord over those who resist. The partition of Africa was the most striking extent of the new imperialism. Thank
Now I'm going to talk about the imperial culture. Imperialism was thoroughly anchored in the culture of late 19th century Europe and the United States. Images of empire were everywhere, not just in the propagandist literature of colonialism supporters, but on tins of tea and boxes of cocoa. Museums and world's fairs displayed the products of empire and introduced spectators to exotic peoples. Was present in novels of the period, sometimes appearing as a faraway setting for fantasy, adventure, or stories of self-discovery. This picture on the right here is one of the example. This is an advertisement from Lipton newspaper promoting the tea garden to teapot, the exclusivity of its product. Advertising techniques and a craving for visual representations of the world were crucial to the development of modern propaganda. The most innovative advertisers of the day were those companies dependent on the imperial economic nexus, bringing home tea, chocolate, tobacco, and a wide array of colonial tales of adventure and their protagonists. Next, please. This is of imperialism propaganda. This is a magazine cover celebrating the French landing in Morocco in 1911. Next, please. Yeah, this is pictures of the continent of Africa. On the left side here, this is a map of Africa in 1886. And on the right side here is the map of Africa in 1914. Africa was divided in 1914 just before the outbreak of the First World War. By this time, European powers controlled 90% of the continent, with only Ethiopia and Liberia retaining independence. Next slide, please. Empire played an important part in establishing European identity during these years. In France, civilizing means demonstrate to the grand change. Many British writers spoke in similar tones. One author wrote, "The British race may safely be called a missionary race. The command to go and teach all nations is one of that the British people have, whether rightly or wrongly, regarded as specially laid upon themselves." In England, the United States, Germany, and France, women's reform movements were full of references to empire. Britain's women's suffrage movement was fiercely critical of the government, but was also nationalist and imperialist. European women in their home countries see themselves as bearers of progress, as participants in a superior civilization. Similarly, John Stuart Mill often used Hindu or Muslim culture as a foil when he wanted to make a point of freedom of speech and religion. This contrast between colonial backwardness and European civility and cultural superiority shaped Western culture and political debate about liberal ideas in particular.
Now I'm going to continue the explanation of imperialism and racial thoughts. So, imperial culture gave a new prominent side to racial thinking. The most important promoter was Joseph Arthur, Comte de Gobineau, who wrote The Inequality of the Races in 1853 or 1855, but it sparked little interest until the period of new imperialism, when it got translated into English and spread widely. So Gobineau claimed that the civilizations established by the three major races of the world, which are white, black, and yellow, and that the peoples of the present day were variously mixed from these original components. The white race, however, had preserved pure bloodlines and was superior. He also stated that all of the races were products of the white races and that no other civilization could emerge without their cooperation. For him, the race offered the master key for understanding human societies in the modern world. Sorry. His work followed from Enlightenment investigations of different cultures in the world, but unlike the authors who attributed to the differences to environmental factors, Gobineau argued that blood was determining factor in human history. Next slide, please. Okay. Followers of Gobineau's racial thinking look increasingly to science to approve their theories. For example, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, an English disciple of Wagner, and Adolf Hitler were among those who turned to Gobineau for inspiration. Next slide. These are the theories that were made from the imperialism. So the first one is Charles Darwin. No racist himself, he introduced the ideas of competition, the struggle for existence, and the survival of the fittest. He attracted wide attention with a theory of evolution that sought to explain the variety of species observed in the world, suggests that all known species to bear spring, and that this process of natural selection explained how species diverged from one another, variations that made individuals better able to find food and made some more likely to be passed on to future generations. The second one is Herbert Spencer. Antedating Darwin, sought to use a similar logic of competition among individuals of groups, suggesting that inequalities of wealth or ability could also be explained as a result of natural selection. And then the last one is Francis Galton, a half cousin of Charles Darwin and a scientist who studied evolution, went so far as to advocate improving the population's racial characteristics by selective breeding of superior types. Galton and others feared that improvements in health, care, and hygiene might allow individuals with inferior traits to survive to reproductive age. And his system of racial management, which he called eugenics, would save European populations from a decline in their vitality and biological fitness.
Okay, next we have opposition to imperialism. Support for imperialism was not unanimous. Polish-born Joseph Conrad, a British novelist, shared much of the racism of his contemporaries. Conrad believed that European racism was an expression of deeply rooted pathologies in European culture. The British Committee of the Indian National Congress gathered together many members of London's Indian community to
educate British public opinion about the exploitation of Indian peoples and resources. The London Pan-African Conference of 1900 was staged at the height of the scramble for Africa, and during the Boer War, the conference grew out of an international tradition of African American, British, and American anti-slavery movement. They protested forced labor in the mining compounds of South Africa as akin to slavery and asked in very moderate tones for some autonomy and representation for African peoples. The Pan-African Conference issued a proclamation to the nation of the world. The proclamation read, "There has been assembled a congress of men and women of African blood to deliberate solemnly upon the present situation and outlook of the darker races of mankind. The problem of 20th century is the problem of color. The British government ignored the conference, but Pan-Africanism, like Indian nationalism, grew rapidly after the last World War."
Next is colonial cultures. Imperialism also created new colonial cultures in other parts of the world, such as Shanghai, who more than tripling in size. Treaty ports like Hong Kong were transformed as European field bank, shipping enterprises, schools, and religious missions. As European and indigenous people encountered and transformed one another, new hybrid cultures emerged. People on both sides of the colonial divide worry about preserving national tradition and identity in the face of these hybrid and changing colonial cultures. In China and India, suggestion that local population adopt European models of education set off fierce controversies. Chinese elite already divided over such custom as foot binding and concubinage, the legal practices of maintaining formal sexual partners for men outside the marriage. Found their dilemmas heightened as imperialism become more powerful force. Proponents of change in China or India thus had to sort through their sense toward Western culture and traditional popular culture. For their part, British, French, and Dutch authorities predicted that too much familiarity between colonized and colonizer will weaken European prestige and authority. In Phnom Penh, Cambodia, part of French Indochina, French citizens live separated from the rest by a moat, and authorities required dressing appropriately and keeping a distance from the natives. Sexual relation provoked the most anxiety and the most contradictory responses. In this hot climate, patients run higher, wrote a French administrator in Algeria. French soldier seek out Arab woman due to the strangeness and newness. It was common practice for unmarried Englishmen resident in China to keep a Chinese girl, and I did as the others did, reported a British man stationed in Shanghai. He married an English woman, however, and he sent his Chinese mistress and their 3 children to England to avoid awkwardness. European administrators faithfully tried to prohibit liaisons between European men and local women, labeling such affairs as corrupting. Such prohibition only drove this relation underground, increasing the gap between the public facade of colonial rule and the private reality of colonial lives. So that's all from our presentation. Thank you.